This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 739 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Last week on the show, I talked through a handful of dynasty buy candidates for the offseason. Today, it's the opposite. I'll be looking at players that you might want to sell. Now, a huge caveat with this. A lot of the players on today's list are good football players. Just because I'm saying that you might want to trade them away doesn't mean that I believe that they're bad. It's just that versus the market, I seem to be a little bit lower on them. That's really what this is all about. So context, as usual, is very important here. And I'll do my best to provide that context. But if you want even more detail, you can always check out my dynasty rankings and tiers over on the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. Now, before I get to the sell candidates, I wanted to send another reminder about the Late Round Prospect Guide, which you can pre-order right now over on lateround.com. In the guide, I break down what goes into my running back and wide receiver prospect models. I then profile every running back and wide receiver who will be at the NFL Combine, and my model spits out a pre-draft percentile score for each player. Then when the draft is over, I'll send an updated version of the guide with post-draft scores and post-draft breakdowns. I also have an entire section dedicated to my Year 2 model. The Year 2 model helps predict how well a player is going to perform in Year 2 and Year 3 of his NFL career. So I profile all relevant running backs and wide receivers from last year's draft class and let you know what to do with them in Dynasty. You can pre-order it right now on lateround.com for just $11.99. It's a PDF that will get emailed to you when it launches on March 13th. And once March 13th hits, that price will rise to $14.99. So again, head to lateround.com and get ready for another fun prospect season. I'm just going to get a controversial one out of the way first. TJ Hawkinson. Yes, I think TJ Hawkinson is a sell candidate. I definitely don't think Hawkinson is a bad player, but I do think we're seeing an inflated average draft position because of his move to Minnesota. And I'm not convinced we're going to see the same TJ Hawkinson in 2022 moving forward. One of the things that I try to preach all the time is that talent drives opportunity. And in Dynasty, situation changes. So we don't want to solely invest in situation. We want to invest in talent, in the player. TJ Hawkinson's last game with the Lions was October 30th. In October this past year, according to Dynasty League Football, Hawkinson was the tight end 8. And he was being drafted 93rd overall. That's when he was with Detroit. In November, so this ADP reflects the team change, his ADP was tight end 6 and 83rd overall. Okay, so it jumped 10 spots in ADP, and he was able to leapfrog a couple of tight ends. But it was reasonable. It was a reasonable jump. After December, Hawkinson's ADP was tight end 4, and he was being drafted 55th overall. It was a massive jump. And he's around that same point here in January. And over on Keep Trade Cut, the market likes him even more. Ask yourself, though, what changed? Why did Hawkinson see such a spike in ADP? Well, the obvious answer is what I just said. He switched teams. Clearly, Hawkinson always had the talent, but he wasn't in a spot where that talent could be showcased. Then he went to Minnesota, and it could be. I think there is some validity to that. Situation changes, and talent is more important, but situation still matters. And it can tell us a lot about a player when he does indeed switch teams. The thing is, I'm not sure TJ Hawkinson was so much better in Minnesota. Let me explain. From weeks 1 through 8 with Detroit this past year, Hawkinson averaged 12.2 PPR points per game. That was skewed by a 40-point performance. But let's just look at that average, 12.2. When he moved to Minnesota in relevant games with the Vikings, that average jumped by 2 points. So clearly he was better, right? I mean, in fantasy football, yes, he was better. But Hawkinson actually averaged a higher yards per route run rate in Detroit than he did in Minnesota this past year. In the regular season, the difference between those two numbers was actually pretty dramatic. It was 1.87 in Detroit and 1.38 in Minnesota. If you add in the playoff game, it does look a little bit better. But his yards per route run rate in Detroit was still about 0.25 yards better. I think there's this idea out there that TJ Hawkinson absolutely dominated in Minnesota, but he really didn't. I mean, he certainly wasn't bad. I'm not trying to say that, but his regular season yards per game averages were pretty similar from Detroit to Minnesota. He had some monster games that twisted those numbers a bit, but the yards per game tallies weren't dramatically different. The reason he was so much better in Minnesota was volume. He was getting a lot of points off of catches. With the Vikings, Hawkinson averaged a target share per game rate of almost 24%. That was closer to 18% in Detroit. So he was seeing more targets. He was averaging 3 more targets per game in Minnesota versus Detroit. The fact that he didn't have dramatically better receiving output compared to Detroit could honestly be viewed as a problem, not a good thing. Because what happens if the volume isn't as high? Now, it's true that volume goes to good players, but the Vikings were seriously lacking outside of Justin Jefferson last year. And let's face it, tight ends don't sustain 24% target shares. We've averaged fewer than 1.5 tight end seasons per year since 2011, where the tight end averages a 24% target share per game or better. And of all of those seasons since 2011, 5 of them came from Travis Kelce, and 4 of them came from Mark Andrews. It just isn't easy sustaining that high of a target share at tight end unless you're a superior player at that position, like one of the best in the league. And no offense to TJ Hawkinson, but he's not that, at least not yet. Hawkinson's best season in yards per route run over his career is 1.6, which is what he had this past year. Travis Kelce's worst season is 1.83. Mark Andrews, 1.95. George Kittle was below that 1.6 number just once, and it was his rookie year. Dallas Goedert has never been below that during his 4 years in the league. Pat Freiermuth, in a much worse situation, was above that mark in 2022. Just to reiterate, this isn't to say that TJ Hawkinson is bad. It's just to say that if you're going to elevate him above someone like George Kittle, which is what's happening on some sites, and well above Dallas Goedert, and well above Pat Freiermuth, what's the basis? The basis seems to be purely volume. And that volume is likely not very sustainable. So to me, Hawkinson is overvalued. I would rather take on someone like Goddard or Freiermuth and get more with them. Because while he's good, and while he can hopefully get even better in that Minnesota offense next year, it seems like people have really inflated that situation and opportunity. One of the things that I think the fantasy community still gets wrong is this idea that a young player shouldn't have a higher ADP in redraft versus dynasty. Take Gabe Davis from last season as a perfect example. I wasn't aggressively getting him in redraft because his ADP was rising, especially in August. But I didn't think he was a horrible pick. He was the right kind of risk-reward player if you could get him in like the late 4th, early 5th round. But I wasn't into acquiring him in dynasty. And I heard about it from people. Listeners asking me how I could be okay with him in redraft but not in dynasty when he's a younger player. And the answer to that is investment. You can win your redraft league very easily if your 5th round pick doesn't pan out. But when you're sending future rookie picks and valuable players in dynasty, it's harder to come back from that. It's a bigger deal. And that's where I was with Gabe Davis last year. This year, I think he's just a general sell everywhere. I don't understand what people are really expecting at this point. Davis had everything this past year. He had the situation, the high-powered offense, the pass-heavy offense, the quarterback. And he scored 11.4 PPR points per game, finishing the season as a wide receiver 4. Davis saw just an 18.6% target share per game rate in an offense that quite literally didn't have a number 2 receiver. And now the Bills are candidates to try to upgrade that position this offseason, which would hurt Gabe Davis even more. And you're still going to take Davis in the top 40 wide receivers in Dynasty above Keenan Allen, Elijah Moore, Wan'Dale Robinson, Darnell Mooney, Calvin Ridley, and Tyler Lockett? I mean, even Jacoby Myers? Because that's where Davis is at on KeepTradeCut.com. And he's in a similar spot according to Dynasty League Football's ADP. It's honestly surprising that you can still get this much for Gabriel Davis after such a disappointing 2022 season. I think it's an example of falling in love with youth without looking at the greater picture, especially considering there's a decent chance the Bills make some moves at wide receiver this offseason. So now's the time to sell, even if it means taking on an older asset. I don't think Davis is bad per se, but there are a lot of good wide receivers being selected after him these days. I've got another pretty controversial take here. I think Kenneth Walker might be a sell in Dynasty. You could argue that right now, today, is Walker's high point. I know that sounds crazy, and I definitely know that it's a risky move to make. He's only played 1 year in the league, and in that year, he almost won Rookie of the Year. But if you look at the market, Walker is consensus RB3, maybe sometimes RB4 in fantasy football. I personally have him at RB5, so I'm not that far off positionally. But that doesn't mean that I think he's a good investment. Let's just look at Walker, the player, first. According to my prospect model, he was the second best running back in last year's class behind Breece Hall. He was a 93rd percentile running back. After his rookie season, he's a 94th percentile guy in the year 2 model. It's honestly lower than I expected him to be. I thought he would be over that 95th percentile mark. But then I dug into things, and I think it makes sense. First off, when he finally got the nod in that backfield, he averaged a 7.5% target share per game rate across the season. He had just 3 games with more than 10% of Seattle's targets. If you remember, a big question mark about Kenneth Walker's profile entering the league centered around his receiving numbers. I think a lot of people misinterpreted what that all meant, though. A bad receiving profile doesn't mean a running back is incapable of catching passes. Good receiving numbers in college, they get signal because it shows that their team is trying to get them the ball in many ways. They're trying to get them the ball as much as possible. Bad receiving profiles rarely turn into great receiving profiles at the NFL level. But Walker being a 10% target share guy in the NFL is definitely in his range of outcomes. With that being said, his year 1 didn't really tell me that he's going to be someone that's going to get to that 13, 14, 15% target share range. Walker's an incredibly exciting player, but he's also a home run guy. Among 41 running backs with 100 or more carries this past year, Walker ranked dead last in percentage of carries that went 0 or fewer yards. He was in the bottom 10 when looking at running backs who gained 2 or fewer yards. That resulted in a success rate, according to Number Fire's expected points formula, that was dead last in the league among these running backs. He had a success rate of 35% this past year. Now, I will say his RB3 ranking within the market, it actually still makes sense despite all of this. But it makes some sense because the running back market is an absolute disaster. There's not a whole lot of clarity. And the fear is that because of the lack of clarity, when we get this new running back class in there, there's absolutely going to be more competition around the league. Thus, a greater potential to push Walker down. Like, just to be transparent, I think Walker had sort of an overrated rookie season. It's not that he wasn't electric. It's not that he lacks that big play upside. It's just that he just received the most first place votes for Offensive Rookie of the Year. And he did that when you have multiple wide receivers who dominated a more important and difficult position. And while that's a real football-related take, it still translates to fantasy. If you look at overall rankings over on Keep Trade Cut, Walker's going 12th overall in single quarterback startups. Before Chris Olave, who I believe not only had the more impressive rookie season, but he's the better asset in fantasy. So this isn't to say that Walker is egregiously priced within his position. It's just the way things are at running back here in February. But that can change quick with this draft class. And it's not like you have to trade Walker for a running back. There are other options out there at other positions. But even if you want to trade him for another running back, you can get DeAndre Swift, a player that I talked about on last week's episode. And you can get DeAndre Swift and a lot more. I'd take a package over Walker right now because I don't think the drop-off is as significant as what the market is showing. He's an amazingly fun player. He's got a lot of juice. He's going to be around for a while. But I do believe he wasn't as good as people believe in 2022. I find Jared Goff's average draft position kind of crazy. Over on Keep Trade Cut, it's QB 16. My friends at Dynasty League Football have him at QB 22, so they're a little bit lower on him. I've actually got him a little bit lower than that. So clearly I'm just lower than the market on him. And one key reason as to why is pretty simple. Where's the upside? I don't mind Goff. And I do think this is a slightly different recommendation in 2 quarterback leagues. Because in Superflex, a player who lacks a ceiling in fantasy football is still viable. In single quarterback leagues, I'm going for upside only. I'm going for that ceiling. I'm striving for a player who can give me a Patrick Mahomes or a Jalen Hurts or a Josh Allen type season. And I can say pretty confidently that we're not going to get that out of Jared Goff. Since 2011, we've had over 60 quarterback seasons where the quarterback averaged 20 or more standard fantasy points per game. 83% of those seasons saw the quarterback average 1 or more points per game with his rushing statistics. Moreover, of the quarterbacks who weren't mobile but still did some serious work in fantasy by scoring 20 points, their average touchdown rate was 6.5%, which is well above the league average. So they're doing some crazy things throwing touchdowns. And it's also well above anything that Jared Goff has ever done in the league. Not only has Goff not even had a 20-point per game season, but he's typically not getting it done on the ground in fantasy. He's failed to reach 1 point per game with his rushing numbers in 3 of 7 seasons. And like I said, he's yet to give us one of those special touchdown rate seasons. The season that you need from a less mobile quarterback in order for him to be relevant in fantasy. Are we expecting things to just completely turn around in year 8 and beyond? Now, I agree that the situation for Goff is absolutely amazing. I think he at least has a chance to give you low-end QB1 numbers if he's starting in Detroit next year. It's not an amazing chance, but it's in his range of outcomes. But I can't imagine drafting him at QB 16 when he's proven to just simply be solid. And we don't even know how much longer he's going to hold that starting job. This isn't a scenario where we know for a fact that Jared Goff will be the starter there for the next 5 or 7 years. The situation is great, but the performance has not been good enough for me to back an 8th-year quarterback who would need to take his game to the next level to be a true difference maker in single quarterback fantasy. The more I've dug into things, the more I'm worried about George Pickens versus market value. My last Dynasty Rankings update actually had Pickens around that market value, just to be clear, maybe slightly below. But Pickens is a very controversial player right now with a super wide valuation range. Some people see him as a cornerstone piece of their roster. Others see him as an obvious sell. Admittedly, I'm not so far on the side of he's definitely a sell, because some of his underlying metrics can be somewhat explained by a really mediocre passing attack during 2022. But the reason I'm bringing him up today is because there are serious truthers out there. And if one of those truthers is in your league, you might be able to cash in. Pickens had a 15.5% target share per game rate in 2022. That number ranks 60th among rookie wide receivers since 2011 who played 8 or more games. In other words, we typically see 5 or 6 rookie wide receivers hit that mark every season. It's not some exceptionally special target share. But some people see Pickens as an exceptionally good player. He also had a pretty mediocre yards per route run rate. Among the 9 rookie wide receivers in 2022 with 50 or more targets, only Romeo Doubs and Alec Pierce had worse yards per route run rates than George Pickens. And among that same group, Pickens was dead last in targets per route run. But we had a good class last year. Let's give this a little historical context. Since 2011, we've seen well over 300 rookie wide receivers fail to hit a 17% target share per game rate while hitting under a 1.5 yards per route run rate. Pickens was a good bit lower than those filters. He had a 15.5% target share per game and a 1.38 yards per route run rate. So I'm not filtering this to where George Pickens is at, because that would make him the best rookie in this sample. He's not the best rookie according to these two metrics within this sample. Other rookie wideouts were better. Guess how many of those rookie wide receivers have given us just one season with more than 16 PPR points per game? Just for some context, 16 PPR points per game is usually a high-end wide receiver 2, low-end wide receiver 1. It's a good season, but it's not an elite season. So we have over 300 rookie wide receivers in this sample. This is a sample of rookies who hit a 17% target share per game rate and a 1.5 yards per route run rate. Only 3 of those wide receivers were able to hit that 16 PPR point per game mark. Those wideouts were Devontae Adams, who started his career off really poorly, DeAndre Hopkins, and Alshon Jeffrey. Now, the good news is that those wide receivers at least profile semi-similarly to George Pickens. It's not like they're all slot guys. But each player also scored as a better prospect than Pickens in my prospect model. Here's my thing with Pickens. I think that he might be slightly overrated as a player because of his circus catches. We know he can make these awesome grabs. It's honestly a little bit like Kenneth Walker. But I don't think that he should be ranked as like a wide receiver 3 or anything like that. Like, I don't have him at wide receiver 35. It's more so that I think a player like Christian Watson is currently a better bet for the future. And he's almost always going after George Pickens in startup drafts. Or I think that you could just take George Pickens and flip him into Marquise Brown plus, or something along those lines, and still not really miss out on massive production at that wide receiver spot. The odds that Pickens is good, they're pretty strong. I think he's going to have a good career. The odds that he's elite is where I have some problems. And some people are willing to pay that elite price. That's why I think it's worth seeing if you can sell really high. Now, just like last week, this isn't exactly the way that I trade. I mean, if you have those players, I definitely see what kind of deal that I could get done. Because I do think that those players are overvalued in general by dynasty managers. But at the same time, none of the players that I mentioned today are bad for fantasy purposes. Some are really good. Some are really good. Some of them I would love to have on my team. And there are more players that I'd look to trade away this offseason too. It doesn't just end with the handful that I talked about today. I just wanted to give you a variety and explain the process and reasoning as to why. Because understanding that process might be able to help you with other players that are on your roster. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've got subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out lateround.com, pre-order that prospect guide. Otherwise, appreciate you guys listening. I'll talk to you later in the week.